What you are about to witness is not a civil exchange of ideas, nor is it a polite discussion wrapped in the illusion of balance. This is a confrontation, one that unfolds when the loudest, most well-compensated voice in sports journalism is dropped directly into a political echo chamber that has long forgotten how to listen. This is what happens when conviction collides with confirmation bias, when reality steps uninvited into a room that has spent years rehearsing applause rather than arguments. Imagine taking a man who built an empire not just on opinions, but on the sheer volume and certainty with which he delivers them. A man whose voice alone can dominate an entire broadcast, and placing him at a table designed to reward agreement, not dissent. This is not a debate in the traditional sense. It is closer to a controlled demolition, the kind where the structure looks stable until the charges are triggered, and the entire illusion collapses inward. This is not merely Stephen A. Smith making a guest appearance on The View. This is reality checking into a hotel that has been fully booked by delusion for nearly a decade. A hotel where inconvenient facts are turned away at the door, where uncomfortable outcomes are blamed on the weather, and where self-reflection has been replaced by self-congratulation. In the vast and deeply polarized ecosystem of American media, there exist two distinct types of predators. The first are the pack hunters, figures who rely on collective agreement, synchronized outrage, and the protective comfort of numbers. They hunt in formation, backed by applause signs, studio audiences, and a carefully curated sense of moral superiority. Their strength lies not in individual precision, but in consensus. Together, they overwhelm their targets, not by proving them wrong, but by drowning them out. And then there is the lone wolf, Stephen A. Smith occupies a category all his own. He is not subtle, he does not whisper, he does not hedge. He is an apex predator of hot takes, a man capable of transforming a routine discussion about a point guard's ankle injury into a Shakespearean monologue about loyalty, betrayal, and legacy. He speaks in headlines, he breathes in viral moments. His currency is attention, and he spends it without hesitation. When ABC invited him down from his ESPN throne to sit across the table, they believed they were welcoming a peer, a fellow member of the media class, perhaps even an ally. They assumed shared professional status would translate into shared perspective. What they failed to understand is that Stephen A. Smith does not have neighbors. He has audiences. The premise of the conversation was simple on paper. Assess the state of the union 1 year into Donald Trump's second term. The host, still visibly shaken by the shock of an election result they had been assured could not happen, approached the discussion from a place of disbelief and lingering grief. They expected solidarity. They expected agreement. They expected Stephen A. to echo their frustrations and validate their despair. But despair is not Stephen A. Smith's business. He does not deal in emotional processing or ideological therapy. He deals in outcomes, in results, in scoreboards. And when he looked at the political scoreboard of the United States, he did not see a tragedy. He did not see an injustice robbed by circumstance or sabotage. He saw a blowout. He saw a team that got outplayed, outcoached, and outworked. He saw a political movement that failed to read the field, failed to adjust its strategy, and failed to connect with the voters it assumed it already owned. To Stephen A., this was not a moral collapse. It was a strategic one. Where others saw a broken system, he saw a losing campaign. Where the panel framed the outcome as a failure of the electorate, he framed it as a failure of leadership, messaging, and accountability. In his world, excuses do not win championships, and they certainly do not win elections. This fundamental difference in world view is where the collision occurred. The table was prepared for a sympathetic exchange, a shared lamentation of how things should have gone. Instead, it became a reckoning, not because Stephen A. was there to defend Donald Trump, but because he refused to defend failure. He refused to pretend that surprise is a substitute for preparation, or that outrage is a replacement for strategy. And in that moment, the echo chamber cracked, not because one man shouted louder than the rest, though he certainly did, but because he spoke a language the room was unprepared to answer, the language of competition, the language of accountability, the language of winning and losing without moral insulation, This was not about politics anymore. It was about reality versus narrative, about what happens when a straight shooter walks into a space built for crooked storytelling, about what happens when the applause stops working and the scoreboard is the only thing left on the screen, and for a brief, uncomfortable moment, the room had no choice but to look at it. And he was ready to tell the losing team, not gently, not diplomatically, but with the precision of a seasoned analyst, exactly why they were sitting on the bench, watching the game slip further and further from their grasp. The geography of this confrontation was deceptively intimate, almost quaint if one were unaware of the intellectual carnage about to unfold. Stephen A. Smith didn't have to board a plane, didn't have to endure a cross-country trek, didn't have to navigate airport security or traffic jams to enter the lion's den. No, all he had to do was cross the hallway. It was as if the battlefield were mere steps away, the entire theater of ideological combat contained within a few feet of polished hardwood floors, soft studio carpeting, and the warm glow of morning studio lights. "I sit right across the hall," he said, settling into his chair with a deliberate, almost ritualistic grace. His suit adjusted with the natural swagger of a man who knows he is the most valuable asset in the building, not just for ratings, not just for the sound of his own voice, but for the undeniable authority he carries in any room he enters. "That's right, it is nice to have you as a neighbor." And there it was, the host's cheerful response, the kind of light, rehearsed corporate camaraderie that morning talk shows excel at. The atmosphere was deceptively light, almost festive, sprinkled with laughter and ease that belied the tension underneath. The audience cheered, clapping politely, oblivious to the fact that they were applauding the very man who was about to dismantle the world, view of the room piece by piece. The host smiled, questions wrapped carefully in the soft cotton of casual banter, like padding designed to protect both the speaker and the audience from the full force of truth. They treated him like a visiting dignitary from the sports world, a charming distraction from the serious business of dissecting the political landscape, an interlude before the main act of indignation and partisan lament. "So it's been a minute since you were here," one host began, the tone measured, seemingly innocuous, but loaded with the subtle trap of civility. "Last time you were here, it was 6 weeks into Trump's term. How are you feeling now, a year in?" It was a perfectly constructed snare. They expected him to sigh, to shake his head, to utter the words that would confirm their shared sense of despair. "Oh, it's been a nightmare, hasn't it?" They offered him a comfortable seat on their carefully polished bandwagon of misery, a place where he could commiserate with the hosts, nod in sympathetic agreement, and provide validation for the audience's sense of outrage. But Stephen A. sat there, sharp-eyed, unblinking, a predator assessing his environment, calculating angles and vulnerabilities. He did not look like a man suffering under a regime, nor did he look like one seeking moral reassurance. He looked like a man analyzing a game tape, breaking down strategy, spotting mistakes, and noting exactly where the failures had occurred. He studied the hosts not with malice, not with condescension, but with the quiet frustration of a coach watching his players miss wide-open layups, of a master strategist observing a team that refused to learn from obvious errors. The hosts pivoted to questions that were designed to elicit outrage. They asked about the affordability crisis, the economic pressures bearing down on average Americans, and they pointedly referenced the president calling democratic concerns a scam. They sought the performance of indignation, the high drama of moral outrage. "Well, that's rhetoric on his part," Stephen A. said, his voice calm, almost measured, each word deliberate and controlled. His hand waved dismissively, a small gesture that undercut the expectation that he would bite. "There's nothing surprising or unpredictable about that. You could see it coming from a mile away." And that was the moment the hosts realized the script had failed. He was not going to perform the expected indignation. He was not going to mimic the outrage they anticipated. Stephen A. was analytical, detached, even clinical. He assessed the rhetoric not as an affront to morality, but as a predictable tactic within a strategic framework. He was watching the moves on the political chessboard with the precision of a seasoned player, considering patterns, reading tendencies, and evaluating outcomes without the cloud of emotional bias. The hosts shifted slightly in their seats, a subtle acknowledgement that the evening had veered sharply off course. The narrative they had rehearsed, the carefully constructed series of traps designed to extract outrage and validate ideological assumptions, was unraveling. He wasn't angry, he wasn't performative, he was calculating. He analyzed Trump's strategy like a defensive scheme being run by Bill Belichick, each motion, each decision, each failure to execute becoming an object of scrutiny. The preset trap of civility was visible, the bait set perfectly, but the prey, the guest, who should have stumbled into it, was circling, inspecting, preparing to dismantle it with precision. The calm, almost ceremonial setup of the show, the smiling hosts, the polite applause, the soft, reassuring banter, all of it was merely the deep breath before the storm. The neighbor from across the hall was not there to comfort. He was there to assess, to critique, to illuminate the gaps between perception and reality. He occupied the room fully, commanding attention without raising his voice, without theatrics, simply by the authority of his presence and the inevitability of his insight. As the hosts prodded, hoping to ignite the expected sparks of emotion, they were met with measured analysis. Each question, designed to draw a moralistic reaction, was met instead with a strategic evaluation. The audience, still clapping politely, had yet to grasp that the dynamic had shifted. They were witnessing an unspoken lesson in accountability, a demonstration of how outcomes, not feelings, determine success or failure. Stephen A. Smith, in that moment, became not just a guest, but an agent of truth within a space optimized for agreement and performance. And so the stage was set, the trap laid with care, the prey prepared for consumption. But the apex predator, the lone wolf, did not stumble. He circled, he observed, he diagnosed. And in the quiet, controlled cadence of his speech, he prepared to deliver not outrage, not theatrics, but the truth, brutal, unvarnished, and entirely unavoidable. This expanded version captures the tension, analysis, and dramatic confrontation of your original paragraph while extending it to around 1,000 words. If you want, I can combine both your paragraphs, the first Trump commentary, and this lion's den scene into a single, ultra, long 2,000 plus word cinematic YouTube script ready for narration, keeping all the metaphors and dramatic storytelling. Do you want me to do that? Stephen A. Smith came to the table with a playbook entirely his own, a playbook that did not include the time-honored gestures of nodding along politely, offering perfunctory agreement, or providing the kind of soft validation that had become a staple of daytime television interviews. He did not arrive to participate in a ceremonial exchange of ideas. He arrived as a competitor, a strategist, a man whose presence alone demanded that the room recalibrate to his pace, his perspective, and, most importantly, his standards. From the moment he settled into the chair, there was a subtle shift in the room, one that would not be immediately perceptible to the casual viewer, but which those attuned to the mechanics of media theater could sense as the prelude to an impending disruption. The first hints of tension surfaced as the conversation pivoted toward the Democrats. The hosts, comfortable and secure within the insulated bubble of their broadcast world, had long operated under a set of assumptions that the blame for political missteps, electoral disappointments, or failed campaigns rested primarily with external forces, the voters, misinformation, or the unpredictability of Donald Trump himself. Within this bubble, Democrats were paragons of principle, constrained only by circumstance, their missteps excused by the chaos of the opposition or the limitations of political fortune. But Stephen A. Smith, channeling the analytical rigor honed over decades at ESPN, leaned forward. The casual, conversational posture of a morning talk show guest was replaced by something sharper, something purposeful. The voice that had silenced co-hosts, competitors, and colleagues in sports studios across the nation began to rise, not in sheer volume, but in intensity, in precision, in the unmistakable cadence of authority. It was the kind of voice that could command attention in a room of chaos without resorting to theatrics, the kind that demanded that listeners engage rather than merely react. He prefaced his assessment with a line that at first glance seemed almost complimentary, almost conciliatory. But in the end, the Democrats give the credit where credit is due. The phrasing, gentle in its surface tone, functioned more as a warning shot than a genuine acknowledgment. It was the verbal equivalent of a pitcher stepping on the mound, winding up, and delivering a fastball precisely where the batter least expects it. What followed was a systematic dismantling of assumption, a methodical recounting of failures so blatant that they could no longer be framed as anomalies, coincidences, or mere misfortune. He began listing defeats with the precision of a statistician cataloging box scores from the previous week. Losses in New York, losses in New Jersey, losses in Virginia. He enumerated battlegrounds like a sports analyst reciting player stats, with the same cadence and the same authority, the same implicit command: pay attention. Each state, each result, each misstep was not just a number. It was a symptom of deeper systemic issues within the Democratic establishment. Clearly, there's something going on within the Democratic establishment that's saying, let's focus on real issues that are pertinent to the American people, he said, his voice tightening slightly as he delivered the line. It was not an accusation, it was an observation, a diagnosis. The room, previously buoyant with the perfumed ease of polite banter, began to grow tense. It was as though a slow, invisible tide of accountability was creeping across the table, washing away the comfort and certainty the hosts had relied upon to maintain composure. And then, with the inevitability of a referee calling a foul in a high-stakes championship game, he delivered the verdict. The trigger was pulled. The words fell into the room like a stone into still water, rippling across the set with immediate, palpable impact. I thought they handed him the election as opposed to him actually winning it, Stephen A. declared, each syllable precise, each word cutting through the room like a scalpel. The effect was instantaneous. The air seemed to leave the room, the invisible current of disbelief almost audible. To voice such an opinion in this particular space, the spiritual home of resistance, the carefully curated bastion of liberal analysis, was nothing short of heresy. He was not asserting, as some might have expected in a partisan framework, that Trump had stolen the election, nor was he claiming that voters had been duped or tricked. He was saying something far more damning, far more subversive. The Democrats themselves had failed. They had choked at the critical moment. They had, in essence, self-sabotaged. The metaphor was clear, stark, and impossible to ignore. He likened the Democrats to the Atlanta Falcons in the Super Bowl, a team possessing talent, promise, and opportunity, yet unable to execute under pressure. Donald Trump, in this analogy, was Tom Brady, methodical, opportunistic, and unflinching, waiting for his opponents to unravel. The comparison, delivered with calm clarity, stripped away all pretense of moral certainty. It was not about villainy, it was not about conspiracy, it was about failure to perform when it mattered most. At this point, the hosts were forced to respond, but the room was already off script. Joy Behar, who had long held the mantle of gatekeeper for the liberal narrative, scrambled to reclaim control, to deflect, to reframe the conversation in terms that were familiar, safe, and predictable. The Republicans were not favored to win any of these. She stammered, attempting to reframe the narrative, to reduce a clear and decisive loss into a statistical anomaly, a minor blip on a broader canvas of partisan expectation. Her words, however, were insufficient to contain the damage. The framing had shifted irreversibly. The narrative bubble had been pierced. The strategic brilliance of Stephen A. was evident not just in what he said, but in how he said it. He did not raise his voice to drown out the hosts. He did not engage in theatrical posturing or rhetorical overreach. He spoke with authority, with clarity, with the analytic precision of a master breaking down failures, one by one, showing the mechanisms of collapse, illustrating how even minor miscalculations compound into catastrophic defeat. Each observation, each critique, each statistical reference served as a building block in a larger architectural dismantling of the host's assumptions and the ideological scaffolding they had relied upon for years. By the time the exchange concluded, The hosts were not merely challenged, they were confronted with a mirror. A mirror reflecting not what they wanted to see, but what actually was. A political establishment that had, through a combination of hubris, mismanagement, and strategic failure, handed victory to an opponent through its own mistakes, not through the heroics or machinations of the opposition. And in that moment, the room, the show, and the audience were forced to reckon with a reality that existed outside of narrative comfort, outside of ideological rehearsal. Reality articulated with the force, clarity, and inevitability of a man who had mastered both the art and the science of observation. Did anyone honestly expect a Republican to win the New York City mayoral race? The question hung in the studio air like a faint, impossible echo, a puzzle that should have been obvious to anyone with even a passing understanding of political geography. Stephen A. Smith looked at the host with the expression reserved for someone watching another person insist, against all evidence, that the sky was green. There was no need for shouting, no need for dramatics. He simply allowed the facts to linger, heavy and undeniable in the air between them. His gaze, steady and piercing, conveyed more than words ever could. The answer was self-evident, and anyone who argued otherwise was arguing against reality itself. New York City, the narrator might observe, is likely the most liberal, politically homogeneous urban center in the entire country. From Manhattan to Brooklyn, from Queens to the Bronx, the ideological leanings of the electorate were so entrenched that any attempt to claim a Republican path to victory would require ignoring decades of demographic trends, voter registration patterns, and electoral history. And yet, within the walls of the studio, the hosts pressed on, confident in the moral arc of their narrative, convinced that righteous outrage and intellectual superiority could overwrite statistical reality. Stephen A., however, was not there to indulge in narratives. He was there to dissect outcomes, to reveal cause and effect, to expose miscalculations for what they were, and the facts, cold and impartial, were not on the host's side. They are going to have to suffer the consequences of their actions in the voting booth. The narrator might interject, a voice cutting through the spin, delivering a simple truth. The electorate cannot be managed by sentiment alone. Eventually, voters' choices manifest as consequences, and only then, in the unflinching mirror of reality, will those who miscalculated recognize the magnitude of their errors. The tension in the studio became almost tangible. Cameras capturing polite smiles and measured laughter could not mask the tightening atmosphere, the subtle unease creeping across the host's expressions. Stephen A. wasn't simply analyzing politics, he was exposing a profound failure in strategy. He was laying bare the cracks in a carefully constructed narrative of moral superiority. While the hosts were obsessing over the tone of tweets, the optics of press conferences, and the latest soundbites, the other side was methodically, relentlessly winning on the ground. Each local contest, each battleground state, each missed opportunity compounded into a pattern too clear to ignore. The hosts exchanged uneasy glances, subtle but telling. The direction of the conversation had veered far from the comfort zone. They had assumed that civility, politeness, and strategic framing would be sufficient to steer the discussion. Now they realized they were adrift. The usual levers of control, the pre-planned questions, the rehearsed reactions, the studio, approved soundbites, were failing. The narrative they had meticulously constructed was slipping through their fingers. Something had to change, something decisive, something undeniable, something that would force Stephen A. back into the fold of predictable commentary. They needed a gotcha. They needed a topic that could override analysis, bypass scrutiny, and compel an unequivocal moral judgment. And so, as if reaching for a weapon in a battle where every move counts, they pivoted to the one topic that had become synonymous with moral outrage and scandal: Jeffrey Epstein. If policy failures and electoral strategy had not ensnared him, perhaps the moral abyss, the specter of criminality, could. They believed that even the most seasoned analyst, the man whose voice had silenced colleagues and commanded studios across the nation, would be forced into moral submission when confronted with the images, allegations, and scandals surrounding Epstein. They imagined incorrectly that here, mid the darkness of his island, the horror of exploitation, and the enormity of human betrayal, Stephen A. would falter, hesitate, or, at the very least, express shock and indignation in a predictable, controlled fashion. The pleasantries of the opening minutes evaporated, the neighborly visit, the casual banter, the polite smiles, all of it curdled into a tense confrontation. Having failed to corner him on the battlefield of electoral strategy, the hosts were now resorting to the darker ammunition in their arsenal, a topic that required moral clarity and invited judgment. The transition was seamless to the untrained eye, subtle in delivery, yet its intent was unmistakable. Trap him in a narrative he could not navigate. House oversight, Democrats released this trove of really creepy photos from inside Jeffrey Epstein's private island. One host began, her voice dropping to a register of solemn disgust, the kind that signals gravity and moral certainty. It was the ultimate trap, the kind of issue that, in their minds, demanded a clear position, condemnation, outrage, denunciation. In the eyes of the hosts, there was no nuance, no room for analysis, no consideration of context or procedural complexity. Here, they believed, was the hammer that could force even the most unflappable guest to kneel. Stephen A. Smith, however, had anticipated the pivot. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. His expression remained steady, calibrated, precise. The studio lights reflected off his eyes, highlighting a subtle but unmistakable intensity. He had come prepared for this exact moment. He had anticipated the moral trap, anticipated the bait, anticipated the assumption that this subject could corner him. In fact, he had brought his own countermeasures, knowledge, experience, clarity, and the unassailable logic of facts over rhetoric. The air in the room grew taut. The hosts, convinced that they were in control, that the pivot would elicit a rehearsed reaction, did not yet understand that they had underestimated their guest. They had assumed that scandal, when paired with moral expectation, could override reason. But Stephen A. did not operate in the realm of assumption. He operated in the realm of evidence, of outcomes, of cause and effect. He could navigate moral complexity without sacrificing clarity, dissecting the narrative with the precision of a surgeon while maintaining the authority of a strategist. As he prepared to respond, it was clear that the dynamic of the room had irrevocably shifted. The pivot to Epstein, intended as a trap, had instead become a stage for Stephen A. to illuminate a broader truth, that analysis, preparation, and understanding of systems, whether political or social, cannot be supplanted by outrage alone. The hosts had brought a knife to a nuclear war, expecting to carve a point of leverage. Instead, they had entered a domain where the rules were different, where preparation and intellect governed the field, and where assumptions and narrative shortcuts would falter. The confrontation, now fully realized, was no longer about pleasantries, not about audience applause, not about the safe space of broadcast performance. It was about reality, clarity, and the consequences of strategic failure. Stephen A. Smith had transformed the interview into a masterclass in analysis, revealing the vulnerabilities, miscalculations, and overconfidence of the hosts, and, by extension, the broader political establishment they represented. Every statement, every pause, every measured tone was a calculated move, demonstrating that knowledge and insight could overpower theatricality and moral posturing, leaving the hosts scrambling, exposed, and confronted by their own assumptions.